Okay, so we're going to talk about IEPs, 504 plans, and we're also going to talk about gifted learners. To start with, the IEP and the 504, one of the differences is that the IEP is basically a plan or a blueprint, um, and it's based on federal education law for the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it's really a plan for the child's experience at school, whereas the 504 plan, a different set of legislation. It was a Rehabilitation Act of '73, and it's more about the access to the tools necessary for learning. And a lot of kids that don't meet the specific requirements for an IEP do meet the requirements for a 504. So it's not quite that it's a full catch-all, but it does allow for students with specific needs to have access to the tools that they need to learn at the same level of the rest of the students. Um, One of the differences with the IEP is that to qualify, there are two specific requirements in that a child must have one or more of 13 very specific disabilities that are listed in the IDEA. And that's where some students that aren't able to be covered by the IEP are still able to be covered by the 504, because maybe they have a disability that's not listed there, specific attention issues, maybe even sensory issues, things like that. Um, the other thing for the IEP is that that disability itself has to affect the child's educational performance and or the ability to learn and benefit from the general education curriculum. Um, the 504 is a lot broader when you talk about how the disability interferes with the child in the normal general education setting, classroom. Um, the As far as the IEP is concerned, the again the legal requirements are um, they're very specific, and some people would say strict in regards to kind of the who, what, when, where of it. Specifically, the program, the IEP, the program's created by a team, and it has to include these people. It has to include the child's parent, at least one of the child's general education teachers, at least one special education teacher, the student psychologist or specialist, and a district representative. So that entire team is very specific. Whereas in a 504, the team are people that are familiar with the child, but it's not set to those specific people listed before in the IEP. Generally it's going to include someone like the child's parent, uh, general special education teacher, and the student principal. But it's not limited to just those specific people, as long as the people that are involved um, have enough access with the student that they really understand and can evaluate what services are needed for that student to be able to succeed at the level of the general population of the students. Um, and again, the plan for an IEP versus a 504 is also different as well. In an IEP, some of the really important parts are must talk about how the child is presently functioning, what their performance in school is. Um, it also is reviewed every single year, whereas the 504, there's not the need, there's not the requirement that it's reviewed every year. It's normally more like every 3 years. There are annual goals for the child in an IEP, and specifics about how the school will track that progress. Um, there are specifics regarding accommodations and modifications, so exactly what will need to be modified and changed, and what accommodations will be made for that child's learning environment. Um, the 504 does include the accommodations as well. and normally talks about who will provide those services. The IEP does the same, but really kind of goes into more in-depth detail. Um, and then consent still required for both. Consent's required in writing for the IEP as far as evaluating the child, and also consent in writing before the school can provide the services in the IEP. Um, Whereas in a 504, parents' consent is required, but it's not, again, it's not that the specifics are so, um, the requirements are not so specific. They're not so, um, it has to be done this exact way. There's more flexibility in a 504. As far as the funding is concerned, um, both of those, both an IEP and a 504, the students are not charged for these services. However, the funding cost for 504 programs are not, um, states don't receive extra funding for that. Whereas with the IEP, some states, most states, receive additional funding for the students that are eligible for those programs. Um, and as far as some accommodations that I think I could easily get into a classroom to be able to accommodate some of those things, I would look at things like vocabulary. When you're, I'm going to be a science teacher, so vocabulary is incredibly important. Making sure that the way that the vocabulary is presented does it in multiple levels. So not only the word, but also a picture that describes the term or the definition, an actual written word description, also an audio file, so that a student needing an accommodation for, for either visual or auditory, or even just needing doing better with the picture, or possibly even a video clip that would be closed captioned, would be a way to deal with vocabulary. And I feel like it would be pretty seamless. And I feel like other students, even those that don't have an IEP or a 504, would be able to benefit from that. Again, if a video clip is listed, another way to accommodate, or another thing to put into the classroom, is making sure that there's a written transcript for any video clip, and having it be closed captioned while it's going is also a good idea. And then just looking at the way assignments are given and completed, making sure that there's more than one format available, so that it's not just straight, here's the information that's needed, you're going to have to do it in a written report. Not every student will be able to do that. So having it available so that the report can be given in a visual way, or the report can be given in an auditory way, or doing it like this in a video, or even if a student had, honestly, just getting creative with that. If a student had maybe attention deficit issues, being able to tweet an assignment so that it's very small snippets rather than it being a long form written project, things like that. Also then for students that might have sensory issues, things like fidget objects, also making sure to break up possible small chunks of time just for motion, so that there's not that sensory overload of being set in one place for too long. And then I found a toolkit basically online. It uses the principles of universal design for learning. It's listed in my references, and it has resources for every single type of discipline and technology tools that you can use to make your lessons and assignments more accessible to all of your students. So I would look to try to incorporate some of those things, and I think that they could all be incorporated fairly seamlessly and would work fairly well. As far as talking about a gifted learner, gifted learners are that's kind of not a moving target, but it changes as far as someone's idea of what a gifted learner is. Originally, we're talking about just looking at IQ. People like Lewis Thurman or some of the early educators who felt like IQ was the best measure for whether or not someone was gifted. And then you start to get to folks, Joseph Renzeli, in 78 was looking at above average ability, high levels of task commitment, and high levels of creativity being the qualities that you expect for a gifted learner. The federal statutory definition is evidence of high performance capability in areas such as intellectual, creative, artistic, or leadership capacity, or in specific academic fields, and who require services or activities not ordinarily provided by the school in order to develop such capacities. I look at a gifted learner as they express some intellectual curiosity, they're critical thinkers, they're highly motivated, they're very creative. Those are the things that I look to for a gifted learner. And then accommodations to make for something like that. Again, technology is fantastic. Um, you know, Offering something that students can be wildly creative in. Padlet, Powtoon, Prezis, things where information can be shared and given in ways that can be as creative as the person driving the product. And then also projects where students are basically asked to make kind of a flipped lesson. Instead of just you give me the information that you learn from this, like you show me, you teach this information to me. That really gives a student who's highly motivated and creative the ability to explore and grasp and critically think about those concepts in a different way. When you're having to give them to somebody else, you really have to engage with that material. And then offering that option to students to do that individually or in groups. That way students that aren't quite as adept at being creative or that aren't necessarily highly advanced critical thinkers or highly motivated, being able to work in a group would be able to balance those different talents. And then, trying to make sure that within each unit that I plan some sort of open-ended creative project, something or activity, so that the students that are definitely grasping concepts quickly have ways to engage with the concepts in more of a hands-on way. Maybe so much as if we were studying something like seismic activity in buildings, giving them a design task where I recently observed a class. We used marshmallows and spaghetti sticks, and they had to build a building. And the building had requirements as far as what could be used, and it had to have different floors, and it had to hold a sandbag, which was to basically make it seem like there are people on there. And the kids had to have that structure sit on a little board that would simulate earthquake activity. And so that engaged them to critically think about what factors would affect the building, how the building would be affected, so that what shape and what structure would most withstand those things. And they were allowed to plan it out beforehand and then rework it a little bit. And so, making sure that there's a project like that in each unit, I feel like gives the students that maybe are further along or grasping the concepts quicker and easier, can actually engage with the material at a higher level. Thanks.